What if the beginning we were taught to trust was never a beginning at all, but a reopening? A door quietly unlocked after something heavy had already passed through. The first clay tablets of Sumer do not speak like the voice of a newborn civilization. They sound older, measured, already accustomed to remembering rather than discovering. There is no visible excitement of first inventions, no lingering astonishment at writing, farming, or cities, only record, only continuity. As if the act of beginning had already been lived through once, somewhere else, by someone else. And, before you allow your body to sink fully into this comfort, take a very small moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if something in what I'm sharing makes you want to stay a little longer. If you wish, share the place and time where you're listening. I'm always curious about the small points of light drifting together tonight. The earliest written civilization does not tell a creation story. It lists, it counts, it archives. Kings appear not as pioneers but as successors. Knowledge is not framed as something painfully learned through trial, but as something received, preserved, guarded. The tone is not of curiosity but of stewardship. Even the language itself feels as though it has already passed through refinement, as if the rough drafts were written in a time that no longer remembers itself. In modern history, beginnings are meant to be loud. They are supposed to announce themselves with rupture and novelty. But Sumer speaks softly, almost apologetically, as though stepping into a room where a conversation had already been underway. When kingship is mentioned, it does not rise from the people. It does not evolve from chaos. It descends. The phrasing is calm, unembellished, and strangely confident, as if no one expected an explanation, as if everyone already understood what that descent implied. This is where the first fracture appears, not in myth, but in tone. The absence of curiosity where curiosity should live. The lack of origin where origins are normally insisted upon. Archaeology confirms the suddenness. Cities emerge with geometry, administration, religious hierarchy, and long-distance trade already aligned. Writing does not stumble. Astronomy does not grope blindly. Agricultural calendars are already synchronized with celestial movement. There is no visible apprenticeship phase, no long trail of mistakes left behind. In most human endeavors, the early stages are messy, tools break, symbols shift, systems contradict themselves. Yet here, coherence arrives whole. And that coherence demands time. Not just years, but generations of adjustment, failure, refinement. Time that does not leave footprints in the layers beneath. It is tempting to dismiss this discomfort by calling it coincidence or compression. Perhaps earlier phases simply have not been found. Perhaps erosion erased them. Perhaps we are impatient. But this explanation begins to thin when the pattern repeats. Not once, but across disciplines. Linguistics, astronomy, urban planning, theology, all arriving together, like synchronized clocks set elsewhere. The Sumerian records themselves do not deny this. They lean into it. They speak of before, but never of first. They acknowledge a world prior to their own, yet refuse to narrate it. Instead, they gesture. A flood, a transition. A moment when continuity was broken and then restored. The past is not erased, it is sealed. This sealing is not violent, it is quiet. There is no catastrophe described in vivid detail, no dramatic lament, only a thin line drawn between what came before and what is allowed to be remembered, as if memory itself were curated, trimmed to a safe length. And here the question shifts, not whether a civilization existed before Sumer, but why Sumer chose not to explain it. Why the first writers of humanity's long memory decided to preserve knowledge without preserving its origin. Why they recorded kings but not the first king. Laws but not the first law. Temples but not the moment sacred space was imagined. In later civilizations, myth grows louder. Gods argue. Heroes rise. Creation becomes theatrical. But Sumer stands apart in its restraint. It does not try to impress. It does not persuade. It states. It catalogues. It remembers selectively. Some scholars suggest symbolism, that the language of descent and antiquity is metaphorical. But metaphors usually invite elaboration. They beg to be interpreted. These do not. They remain fixed, repeated across texts without explanation, as though explanation were unnecessary or forbidden. The absence becomes more striking when placed beside what is present. There is immense care in measurement. Time is divided precisely. Space is organized deliberately. Authority is structured. These are not the priorities of a culture struggling to understand itself. They belong to a society focused on maintenance, not discovery. Maintenance implies inheritance. It implies something received intact enough to require preservation rather than invention. And inheritance always carries with it the question of loss. What was damaged? What was missing? What could not be carried forward? If Sumer is not the first chapter, then it is a continuation written by those who knew they were not at the beginning. And if that is true, then the silence around what came before is not ignorance. It is a decision. That decision echoes outward, through later empires, through religious institutions, through chronologies that grow increasingly confident the closer they approach the present. The deeper the past, the more cautious the language becomes. Dates soften, stories blur, certainty dissolves. Modern timelines are built on foundations that quietly assume uniqueness. That civilization arose once, stumbled, and slowly climbed toward us. But the earliest voices we have do not share that assumption. They speak as inheritors, not founders. As caretakers of a legacy whose origin they do not disclose. This does not require conspiracy to feel unsettling. It requires only pattern recognition. The recognition that memory behaves differently after trauma. That stories shorten when loss is too large to name. That continuity sometimes survives only by refusing to remember how it was broken. If there were civilizations before, they did not vanish without residue. They would leave alignments, habits, symbols, ways of organizing reality that feel strangely familiar, even when their source is unknown. And perhaps that is what we are seeing. Not evidence of greatness lost, but evidence of repetition. Civilization as recurrence rather than progression. Knowledge as something rediscovered, not invented. Humanity as something that wakes up repeatedly, each time believing it is the first. The Sumerian records do not argue for this. They do not defend it. They simply exist in a way that makes alternatives uncomfortable. They open a space where the question becomes unavoidable. If this was not the first civilization, then how many came before, and more quietly still? What determines whether one is remembered and another allowed to fade? Numbers are supposed to clarify. They are meant to anchor stories to reality, to limit imagination, to make exaggeration impossible. Yet in the Sumerian king list, numbers do the opposite. They stretch. They refuse containment. They drift far beyond the edges of what the human body can survive, let alone rule through. Kings reign not for decades, but for tens of thousands of years. Dynasties persist longer than entire geological epochs of recorded human history. And all of this is written without apology, without commentary, without a hint that the scribe expected disbelief. The discomfort begins quietly. At first, it feels like a translation issue, a misunderstanding of ancient units, a symbolic shorthand. Scholars have offered many such explanations. Perhaps the numbers represent seasons. Perhaps they encode cycles. Perhaps they are ritual exaggerations meant to glorify authority rather than document fact. These explanations are careful, reasonable, and familiar, yet none of them fully dissolve the unease. Because even when adjusted, even when softened, the durations remain strangely inflated, still excessive, still out of alignment with the biological limits of any known human society. More unsettling than the numbers themselves is their consistency. The king list is not a mythological poem. It is a bureaucratic document. It moves methodically from city to city, from ruler to ruler, maintaining the same tone throughout. When the flood is mentioned, it is not dramatized. It is noted, almost administratively, as a dividing line. Before the flood, kingship existed. After the flood, kingship resumed. The numbers change, but the structure remains intact. This is not the language of legend, it is the language of record-keeping. If the intent were purely symbolic, inconsistency would be expected. Poetry wanders, myth contradicts itself, but here precision dominates. Even implausibility is carefully measured. Each reign has a length, each transition is accounted for. The scribes do not hesitate, they do not hedge, they do not warn the reader that something should not be taken literally. They write as if the reader already understands how to read these figures. This raises a quieter question, not whether the numbers are true, but why they are presented this way at all. If the purpose were only ritual, simpler symbols would suffice. If the purpose were mythic, embellishment would follow. But instead, the list remains austere. Names, cities, durations, transfer of authority, again and again. One possibility lingers beneath the surface, that these numbers belong to a different context of existence altogether, not necessarily to individual human lifespans, but to a structure of time no longer accessible, a framework where authority persisted across spans that feel impossible only because we measure them through modern assumptions. Geology teaches that the Earth does not move at human speed. Climate shifts, magnetic reversals, and mass extinctions unfold across timescales that dwarf political history. When ancient texts speak in large numbers, they may not be exaggerating. They may be refusing to compress. They may be preserving durations that no longer fit the scale of later humanity. The king list itself hints at discontinuity. The flood is not merely a story, it is a reset point. Before it, reigns are vast. After it, they shorten dramatically, still long, but suddenly approaching the realm of the possible. This transition is not explained, it is simply marked, as if everyone knew why time itself had changed. Modern readers tend to assume metaphor at this juncture, but metaphor usually invites meaning. Here, meaning is withheld. The text does not say the flood punished arrogance, or cleansed sin, or renewed morality. It says only that it happened, and that afterward kingship continued, changed but continuous. This is where interpretation becomes fragile. If the flood marks a boundary between two modes of existence, then the earlier numbers may not be exaggerations at all. They may belong to a world governed by different constraints, a world where longevity, stability, or even biology itself followed rules no longer in effect. Such thoughts are often dismissed as speculative, yet they arise not from imagination, but from the refusal of the text to behave as expected. The scribes could have softened the numbers. They could have mythologized them. They could have explained them away. Instead, they preserved them exactly, even when doing so risked incomprehension. This preservation suggests intention, a desire to transmit something intact, even if its meaning would later be lost, like copying a formula without understanding its application, like repeating a ritual long after forgetting why it began. The king list does not argue for divine kings, it assumes them. It does not defend its chronology, it states it. This confidence is perhaps the most unsettling element of all. Confidence implies precedent. It implies a tradition older than the document itself. And if the list is inherited rather than invented, then the scribes may not have been authors in the modern sense. They may have been custodians. Their task was not to interpret, but to preserve. Not to question, but to maintain continuity across a break they could not repair. This would explain the emotional flatness of the text. Trauma often produces minimalism. After loss on an unimaginable scale, elaboration becomes unnecessary. Only the skeleton remains, names, numbers, transitions, enough to remember that something existed, without reopening what was lost. If civilizations existed before the flood, however one defines it, their memory would not survive as narrative. It would survive as residue, as structure without explanation, as numbers that no longer fit the bodies meant to embody them. The question then is not whether these reigns literally occurred, but what kind of world would make them reasonable. A world stable enough to support continuity over tens of thousands of years. A world not yet subjected to the rapid oscillations that now define human history. Such a world would feel alien to us, and perhaps that is why it is sealed behind numbers rather than described. Description invites imagination. Numbers resist it. As this layer settles, the king list remains where it has always been. Neither myth nor history, neither explanation nor fantasy, a document that quietly refuses to collapse into comfort. And if the first recorded civilization chose to remember time this way, the question that follows is not how long those kings lived, but why later civilizations learned to forget such spans altogether. What changed, not in memory, but in the scale of existence itself. There is a phrase that appears without ceremony, without ornament, and without explanation, yet it carries a weight that never quite settles. Kingship descended from heaven. It is written as if it were administrative fact, not metaphor. No preface prepares the reader, no justification follows. The phrase simply arrives, already complete, already accepted, already beyond debate. In later cultures, such a statement would be surrounded by story. There would be a struggle among gods, a theft of fire, a rebellion, a bargain. But here, descent is presented as transfer. Authority moves from one realm to another as calmly as a seal pressed into wet clay. There is no drama in the motion, only consequence. Modern interpretation often reaches for symbolism. Heaven becomes an abstraction. Kingship becomes legitimacy. The descent becomes social agreement. These readings are not wrong, but they feel incomplete. They answer a different question than the one the text seems to pose, because the issue is not what heaven means, but why descent is necessary at all. If authority were born from human need, it would rise. It would emerge slowly, negotiated through conflict, necessity, and survival. Instead, Sumer describes power as arriving fully formed, not discovered, not earned, delivered. Language matters here. The original phrasing does not suggest inspiration or guidance. It implies relocation. Something that existed elsewhere now exists here. Something structured, coherent, already functional. This creates a tension with what follows. Because once kingship is present, everything aligns around it. Cities organize, law crystallizes, calendars synchronize with celestial cycles. The social world behaves as though a framework has been installed rather than invented. The absence surrounding this descent is striking. There is no description of resistance, no mention of disbelief, no account of how people reacted when authority arrived from beyond their world. The silence implies familiarity, as if this had happened before, as if descent were part of a known rhythm. This rhythm appears again in the flood narrative. The world ends, or at least breaks. Then kingship descends again. The same phrase, the same calm tone. Different cities, different rulers, but the same assumption of continuity. Authority survives catastrophe by re-entering the human sphere rather than re-emerging from it. What kind of memory produces such language? Not the memory of invention, but the memory of restoration. Not the excitement of first contact, but the fatigue of repetition. The descent motif appears elsewhere, scattered across cultures separated by oceans and millennia. Authority, knowledge, and order are rarely portrayed as human achievements in their earliest tellings. They arrive from above, from beyond, from before. And while later traditions dramatize this arrival, Sumer refuses to embellish it. This restraint suggests that the scribes were not attempting to persuade. They were not constructing belief. They were recording inheritance. Heaven, in this context, may not denote a spiritual realm at all. It may simply indicate non-human origin, not divine in the religious sense, but external to the immediate human condition. A source beyond the visible horizon of memory. This interpretation unsettles modern sensibilities because it removes humanity from the centre of its own story. It suggests that civilization is not a triumph, but a receipt. Something handed over, not built from scratch. Yet the text does not celebrate this. It does not glorify the givers. It barely acknowledges them. Heaven is not described. Its inhabitants are unnamed in this context. What matters is not who gave, but that something was given. And perhaps that is the most revealing detail. The giver fades, the gift remains. If knowledge, authority, and structure arrived already assembled, then the role of early civilization was preservation, not creation. This aligns with what we see elsewhere, a fixation on record-keeping, on repetition, on maintaining cosmic order rather than challenging it. Innovation appears later, after memory degrades, after the origin of descent becomes myth instead of record. When certainty dissolves, imagination rushes in to fill the gap. But at this early stage, imagination is unnecessary. The system is intact. The rules are known. The descent has happened before, and it will happen again. This cyclical understanding reframes the flood itself, not as punishment, but as reset. Not as moral judgment, but as interruption. The flood ends a phase, not the experiment. Kingship pauses, then resumes. Heaven reconnects. If this is true, then the Sumerian worldview is not linear. It is layered. Time does not move forward into novelty. It loops through recovery. Such a worldview would produce a culture deeply invested in continuity and deeply suspicious of change. And indeed, Sumerian religion emphasizes balance, order, and appeasement. The goal is not progress, but survival within an inherited structure. The question then becomes uncomfortable. If kingship descends, what ascends? What is lost upward when civilizations fall? What returns to heaven when the world can no longer support it? The texts do not say, they do not mourn, they do not accuse, they simply note transitions, as if loss were expected, as if erasure were not failure, but function. Modern readers often search for villains in such stories, gods who control, elites who suppress, but the Sumerian material resists this framing. There is no sense of conspiracy, only resignation. Perhaps the most disturbing possibility is not that something controlled history, but that history itself is shaped by forces indifferent to human narrative, forces that build, withdraw, and rebuild without concern for continuity of memory. If so, then the descent of kingship is not a gift or a curse. It is a phase change, a signal that the conditions are once again suitable for order, and if order has descended before, it may descend again. The question left suspended is not who brought it, but why it leaves, and whether those living within its shadow ever recognize the moment before it lifts away. Because once authority ascends, what remains is not chaos, but silence. And silence, as the Sumerians seem to understand, is where the next cycle begins. Between what is remembered and what is forgotten, there is often a thin physical line. Not a metaphor, but a boundary pressed into the earth itself. Layers of sediment, compacted quietly over time, carrying within them the memory of water, pressure, and disappearance. In Mesopotamia, archaeologists have long noted such layers, bands of river clay separating human occupation from what lies beneath. They do not scream catastrophe, they whisper interruption. Flood stories are common enough to feel almost universal. They appear in Sumer, Akkad, Babylon, later echoed in Hebrew texts and far beyond the Near East. Because of this repetition, they are often treated as symbolic, moral, or exaggerated. But symbolism usually grows louder with distance. In Sumer, the flood is described with restraint. It is acknowledged, not performed. A factual boundary rather than a narrative climax. The flood is not framed as the beginning of history, but as a divider within it. Something existed before. Something continued after. What lies in between is not elaborated, as though elaboration were unnecessary or impossible. Geology complicates this silence. The end of the last ice age was not gentle. Rapid warming events, sudden glacial melts, rising sea levels, and massive freshwater discharges reshaped coastlines and river systems within human timescales. Entire landscapes vanished beneath water. River valleys flooded repeatedly. Settlements built close to water, as early human settlements almost always were, would have been erased efficiently, leaving little behind but disrupted soil. This is not speculation. It is measurable. Sediment cores preserve these moments. Climate proxies record abrupt shifts. What remains uncertain is not whether such floods occurred, but how much human memory they consumed. In Mesopotamia, early cities cluster along rivers that are both lifelines and threats. Flooding is seasonal, expected, managed. But the flood described in the king list is different. It is singular. It does not recur. It is not agricultural. It ends a world and begins another. What is most striking is how little cultural trauma surrounds it. No long lamentations, no obsession with guilt, no detailed survival stories. Instead, there is procedural continuity. After the flood, kingship resumes, authority relocates, cities rise again. This tone suggests familiarity, not with that particular flood, but with the concept of reset. As if the culture understood collapse not as annihilation, but as recurrence. Archaeology supports this ambiguity. Below some of the earliest known urban layers lie traces of human activity that do not align neatly with later development. Tools without clear progression, structures without clear lineage, gaps where continuity should exist. These absences are often attributed to erosion, excavation limits, or lack of evidence. Reasonable explanations. Yet absence itself becomes a pattern when it repeats across regions and eras. The flood, then, may not represent a single event, but a class of events, a mechanism by which continuity is broken while memory fragments survive, enough to resume, not enough to explain. In this light, flood mythology becomes less about water and more about forgetting. Water is simply the most efficient eraser available to a planet dominated by coastlines and rivers. If civilizations before Sumer existed primarily in low-lying regions, river deltas, fertile plains, coastlines now submerged, their material culture would be among the first to disappear. Stone survives, clay dissolves, wood rots. The archaeological record would favour what came after. What survives, then, is not the civilization, but the idea of civilization. Templates, measurements, organizational instincts. These do not require ruins, they require transmission. This may explain the strange confidence of early Sumerian systems. They behave like remembered solutions rather than experimental ones, like answers reused after the questions have been forgotten. The flood becomes a curtain rather than a wall. It hides the previous act while allowing the stage to be rebuilt using familiar marks on the floor. Later cultures dramatize the flood because by then, the memory of recurrence has faded. Catastrophe becomes moralized. Blame enters the story. The flood becomes a lesson rather than a mechanism. But in Sumer, the mechanism is enough. The flood is not blamed. It is acknowledged. This suggests a worldview shaped by long exposure to instability, a culture that does not expect permanence, only phases. In such a worldview, survival depends not on preserving everything, but on preserving what can be rebuilt. What is rebuilt is not material abundance, but structure, authority, calendar, law, relationship between sky and land. These survive floods more easily than walls. If this is true, then the flood is not the end of civilization, but its filter. What passes through is what defines the next cycle. The unsettling implication is that our current civilization may also be living above such a filter, that beneath our certainty lies a similar line, waiting to be drawn by forces indifferent to memory. The Sumerian texts do not warn against the flood. They do not propose prevention. They simply acknowledge that after it something resumes. Perhaps warning was unnecessary. Perhaps the flood was not avoidable. Or perhaps it was expected. The flood layers in the soil do not accuse. They record. They hold within them a quiet suggestion that the earth has erased complexity before, and done so cleanly. And if that erasure left behind only fragments, numbers too large, phrases too calm, systems too complete, then Sumer may not be the first civilization to awaken after water receded. It may simply be the first to write while still remembering that others had already done so, long before the rivers rose again. Cities are usually expected to reveal their childhood, the awkward phases, the tentative layouts, the evidence of learning how to live together at scale, narrow paths that later become roads, shelters that slowly hardened into walls, administrative chaos that gradually finds order. But when the earliest cities of Sumer enter the archaeological record, they do so without hesitation. They arrive already knowing what they are: Eridu, Kish, Uruk. Their names are spoken with familiarity in the texts, as if they require no introduction. Excavation reveals layered construction. Temples were built upon temples, each aligned with deliberate care. Sacred space does not wander, it stays fixed, even as the city grows around it. This suggests not improvisation, but adherence, a commitment to a plan older than any single generation. Uruk, in particular, unsettles expectations. Its scale appears suddenly. Population density increases rapidly. Specialized labor emerges. Writing develops not as art, but as administration. Lists, inventories, distributions. The city does not experiment with complexity. It assumes it. This assumption carries weight. Complexity is fragile. It does not arise easily. It requires coordination, surplus, trust in systems that outlive individuals. When complexity appears abruptly, it implies rehearsal, as if the mistakes were made elsewhere, in a time or place no longer accessible. The temples tell a similar story. They are not crude, they are precise, oriented carefully, reconstructed faithfully, layered not to improve design, but to preserve it. The emphasis is not innovation, but continuity. Each rebuild respects what came before, even when materials change. Such behavior suggests reverence, but not awe. Awe belongs to the new. Reverence belongs to the inherited. The builders act as caretakers of something already sacred, not inventors of meaning. Trade networks reinforce this impression. Materials arrive from distant regions. Stone, metals, shells, implying established roots, agreements, and mutual understanding. These are not the products of isolated communities tentatively reaching outward. They belong to a world already interlinked. If Sumer were truly the first, its early phase would be local, experimental, uneven. Instead, it behaves like a node reactivated within an older network. This network need not have been global in the modern sense. It only needed to exist long enough for patterns to settle, for standards to emerge, for shared assumptions about authority, value, and exchange to stabilize. The texts again remain restrained. They do not celebrate the founding of cities. They do not mythologize their construction. Cities are treated as givens. When they are destroyed, they are mourned. When they rise, they are not explained. This asymmetry matters. Cultures tend to narrate what they do not understand, what requires explanation, what is fragile or new. Silence, in contrast, often marks familiarity. Even conflict appears subdued in these early accounts. War exists, but it is procedural. Boundaries are contested, but within an accepted framework. There is no sense of a world discovering violence for the first time. The same can be said for law. The concept of codified rules emerges not as a philosophical breakthrough, but as an administrative necessity. Justice is not debated, it is implemented. All of this suggests a civilization more concerned with alignment than exploration, with fitting into a pre-existing order rather than defining one. The question returns, quietly persistent. If these cities were not the first, then where were the others, and why do they not remain? One answer lies beneath water. Coastlines have shifted dramatically since the end of the last ice age. Fertile regions once exposed are now submerged. Any early urbanism located there would be archaeologically invisible, sealed beneath sediment and sea. Another answer lies in materials. Stone survives, clay dissolves, wood vanishes. A civilization built differently would leave little behind, especially after repeated flooding. But perhaps the more important answer lies in intention. Not all civilizations aim to be remembered. Some may prioritize function over monument, efficiency over permanence. When such cultures collapse, they leave patterns rather than ruins. Patterns are harder to detect. They appear as coincidences, as abrupt competence, as systems without origin stories. The early Sumerian city behaves like a memory enacted in architecture. Streets align not because they must, but because they should. Buildings cluster not randomly, but according to inherited logic. Social roles exist before they are justified. This inherited logic is never explained because explanation is unnecessary to those inside it. Only outsiders feel its absence. Later civilizations will romanticize origins. They will tell stories of founders, heroes, and divine mandates. But here, in the earliest layers, romance is absent. There is only function. This may reflect a worldview shaped by repeated loss. When worlds end, what survives are not stories, but structures. And those who rebuild learn quickly that survival depends on remembering what worked, not on celebrating what was lost. Thus, cities rise not as triumphs, but as recoveries. Each wall rebuilt is an echo. Each temple realigned is an act of fidelity to something older than the city itself. The cities of Sumer do not proclaim themselves first. They do not claim originality. They stand as if aware that they are inheritors, not originators. If this awareness existed, it would shape everything. Politics would emphasize legitimacy over innovation. Religion would prioritize appeasement over revelation. Knowledge would be guarded, not expanded recklessly. Such a civilization would look stable, confident, and strangely quiet about its beginnings, and perhaps that is exactly what we see. The earliest cities do not shout their arrival. They settle into place, already knowing where to stand, as if they are returning to marks left on the land long before their current names were ever spoken. What remains unresolved is not how these cities functioned, but what memory guided their hands as they were raised again from the soil. Because one does not rebuild so precisely without having built and lost something before. Some figures do not behave like gods, and they do not behave like humans either. They stand in between, not as symbols, but as instructors. In the earliest Sumerian imagination, these figures are not conquerors or creators. They are teachers, bearers of order, messengers of something already complete. They are called apkalu. They do not arrive in a world that is empty. They arrive in a world that is capable but unfinished. Humanity already exists. Cities will exist. What is missing is alignment, knowledge, structure, the invisible scaffolding that allows complexity to endure. The apkalu do not invent this scaffolding in front of human eyes. They deliver it. Writing, agriculture, measurement, ritual order, cosmic balance. Each domain is assigned. Each instruction is specific. The emphasis is not on genius, but on transmission. What is striking is how restrained these stories are. The apkalu are not praised endlessly. Their deeds are not dramatized. They appear, teach, and withdraw. Their task is not to rule, but to correct. Later traditions turn them into hybrids, Fish-cloaked beings, liminal forms bridging water and land, chaos and order. This imagery is often dismissed as symbolism, a way of encoding abstract ideas. But symbolism does not emerge without cause. It crystallizes around something difficult to name directly. Water appears again. The Apkallu are associated with the deep, with primordial waters, with the time before separation. They emerge from a realm that predates structured human society, and then recede back into it. They do not remain. Their presence suggests a world where knowledge is not discovered independently by each civilization, but redistributed after loss, as if civilization does not climb upward, but is periodically reseeded. This interpretation aligns uncomfortably well with everything that surrounds it. The sudden coherence of Sumerian systems, the inherited tone of its texts, the lack of origin stories, the confidence without explanation. If knowledge had been reinvented locally, mistakes would be visible. Competing systems would clash. Instead, Sumerian culture presents a unified cosmology. Heaven, earth, authority and labour fit together without friction. The Apkallu myth does not celebrate human cleverness. It emphasises human insufficiency. Without guidance, order collapses. With guidance, it stabilises. This worldview is not flattering. It places humanity in a dependent position. Not enslaved, but unfinished. Capable of maintenance, not genesis. What follows the Apkallu is even more revealing. After a certain point, they are no longer permitted to intervene. The stories shift. Knowledge becomes more fragmented. Power becomes more localized. The divine-human boundary hardens. This transition is not explained as punishment. It is simply noted, as though access has been withdrawn, not revoked. Such a narrative makes sense only in a world that has experienced multiple cycles of loss and recovery. A world where intervention is temporary by design, where stability is a phase, not a destination. Modern readers often project fear onto this idea. Fear of control, fear of manipulation, but the Sumerian tone contains neither resentment nor awe, only acceptance. The Apkallu are remembered because they are gone. Their absence is what gives them weight. If they were merely symbolic, their role would fade as culture evolved. Instead, their memory persists precisely because something essential seems to have been lost with them. Not technology, but coherence. After their departure, human history accelerates. Conflict increases. Innovation becomes chaotic. Myths multiply. Explanations proliferate. This is the paradox. Guidance produces stability but stagnation. Absence produces creativity but fragility. If the Apkallu represent a mechanism by which civilization is reset and aligned after collapse, then their withdrawal signals the beginning of decay. Slow at first, then accelerating. Such a mechanism would not need to be benevolent or malicious. It would only need to function. Like ecological succession, like fire clearing a forest so new growth can emerge. In this framework, civilizations are not linear projects. They are ecological events. They rise, stabilize, fragment, and collapse. Knowledge is not accumulated indefinitely. It is recycled. The Apkallu myths may preserve memory of a time when this recycling was more explicit, when the handoff between cycles was still visible. This would explain why later cultures mythologize the past more intensely. As memory degrades, instruction becomes story. Story becomes religion. Religion becomes doctrine. By the time writing spreads beyond administrative use, the original context is already fading. The Apkallu become monstrous or divine. Their role is misunderstood, exaggerated, feared. But in their earliest appearance, they are simply instructors. And instructors imply curriculum. Curriculum implies repetition. One does not teach the same lesson once. If humanity has been taught before, then Sumer is not the first classroom. It is simply the first to keep notes that survived. This does not require imagining lost super-civilizations with impossible machines. It requires only accepting that complexity may have existed in forms and places that do not fossilize well. That intelligence does not always announce itself with stone. What survives floods is not brilliance, but method. Not monuments, but patterns of thinking. Those patterns can be reactivated quickly, even after long dormancy. The Apkallu may represent the last visible trace of that reactivation process, a moment when continuity was still consciously restored rather than unconsciously reinvented. If so, their disappearance marks a turning point. After it, humanity is on its own, with inherited tools but fading memory of their origin. And perhaps that is why later civilizations begin to argue about truth, fight over gods, and compete for legitimacy. The shared reference point is gone. What remains is a quiet suspicion that order was once easier, that knowledge once arrived whole, that something stood between chaos and continuity, and no longer does. The Sumerian texts do not lament this loss. They simply acknowledge that it happened, and in doing so, they leave us with a question that refuses to settle. If teachers once returned after collapse and then stopped coming, what changed? There is a moment in early human history where several thresholds are crossed at once. Writing appears alongside accounting. Agriculture stabilizes in tandem with astronomy. Social hierarchy emerges at the same time as standardized law. These developments are usually explained as the natural outcome of population growth, environmental pressure, and incremental innovation. Each explanation is reasonable on its own. Together they begin to feel strained. Technological change rarely behaves like this. In every other documented period, advances arrive unevenly. One field surges ahead while others lag behind. Tools improve faster than social systems, or ideology outpaces infrastructure. But in early Sumer, progress is synchronized. Multiple domains lock into place together, as if responding to a single underlying framework. This synchronization is subtle, but persistent. Writing does not begin as art or expression. It begins as administration. Lists of goods, rations, measurements. This implies surplus, redistribution, and trust in centralized systems. Agriculture is already reliable enough to support non-farming specialists. Astronomy is precise enough to regulate planting cycles and ritual calendars. None of these can function in isolation. The usual explanation is co-evolution. That once agriculture produces surplus, specialists emerge, writing follows, and astronomy refines agriculture further. But this model assumes gradual feedback. What we see instead is immediate compatibility. The systems fit together too cleanly. This raises an uncomfortable possibility. That these systems were not developed independently, but adopted as a package. Not invented step by step, but remembered. Memory does not require perfection. It requires familiarity. One can rebuild a complex machine without fully understanding its origin, provided one remembers how it is supposed to work. This produces competence without curiosity, function without theory. The earlier Sumerian texts reflect this pattern. They do not speculate. They do not ask why the heavens move as they do. They track them. They record. They predict. Astronomy is practical, not philosophical. It serves order, not wonder. The same is true of mathematics. Numbers are used to manage land, labour, and time. There is little evidence of abstract exploration in these early stages. Mathematics exists to sustain systems already in motion. This is not the behaviour of a culture discovering itself. It is the behaviour of one reactivating known procedures under new conditions. Technological asymmetry often leaves traces. If one field advances faster than others, artifacts betray the imbalance. In Sumer, such imbalance is hard to find. The tools, texts, and institutions support each other seamlessly. This does not imply perfection. Mistakes exist. Conflicts arise. But the foundational alignment remains intact. Later, civilizations will struggle to replicate this balance. Innovations will disrupt social order. New technologies will outpace ethical frameworks. Progress will become uneven and volatile. Sumer does not exhibit this instability in its earliest phases. Its instability comes later, after expansion, competition, and fragmentation. This suggests that early stability was inherited, not achieved. A starting condition rather than an outcome. One might argue that we are simply missing the earlier, messier phases, that they existed but left no trace. This is possible. But when absence aligns across multiple domains, it becomes harder to dismiss. The absence of early experimentation in writing, the absence of proto-calendars, the absence of transitional social forms, each absence alone is explainable. Together they form a pattern. Patterns invite interpretation, but they do not demand belief. They simply persist. If civilization has reset before, then each reset would favour speed over exploration. Survivors would rebuild what they remember works, not what they can afford to test. Innovation would be dangerous. Stability would be prized. This would produce cultures that appear suddenly competent, cultures that value continuity over creativity, cultures that treat knowledge as inheritance rather than conquest. Sumer fits this profile. Its myths reinforce it. Knowledge comes from elsewhere. Authority descends. Teachers arrive. The past is acknowledged but not narrated. Even the gods behave administratively. They assign roles. They maintain balance. They punish disruption, not ignorance. This is not the mythology of a species intoxicated by discovery. It is the mythology of one trying to avoid collapse. Such a mindset would not celebrate novelty. It would mistrust it. Change would be tolerated only when necessary. The paradox is that this very caution may have enabled early success. By resisting uncontrolled innovation, Sumer preserved alignment long enough to stabilize complex systems. But alignment without renewal eventually rigidifies. Systems become brittle. When shocks arrive, they break rather than adapt. This brittleness may explain why later civilizations collapse more dramatically. They inherit structure without the memory of why it works. They innovate without understanding consequences. The early synchronization, then, is both a strength and a warning. It suggests that civilization can be rebooted quickly under the right conditions. But it also suggests that something essential is lost in the process, something that once allowed knowledge to arrive whole. If we are the seventh civilization as the pattern implies, then we are not the first to experience synchronized beginnings. We are simply the farthest removed from remembering them. Our technologies advance unevenly. Our ethics lag behind our tools. Our systems strain under their own complexity. This imbalance feels new, but it may be the natural state of civilizations that have forgotten their original alignment. The Sumerian record does not tell us how alignment was achieved. It only shows us what it looks like when it exists, and in doing so, it leaves a quiet question hanging in the space between then and now. If civilization once began in harmony, not chaos, what would it mean to recover that memory, rather than repeat its loss? And whether such recovery is even possible, once the cycle has already moved on. There are moments in Earth's history where time seems to fold inward, where centuries of change compress into a few unstable generations. Ice retreats not gradually, but violently. Oceans surge into places that once held forests and camps and pathways. The sky itself appears to shift, stars rising where they once set. These moments do not announce themselves as endings. They feel, to those living through them, like confusion. Modern science has given these moments names. Abrupt climate events, meltwater pulses, the Younger Dryas, technical language that softens the reality it describes. Because from a human perspective, such events are not data points, they are erasers. The Younger Dryas in particular unsettles linear history, a sudden return to near glacial conditions after a period of warming, then just as abruptly a rapid warming again, within a span short enough to be remembered, yet long enough to remake the planet's surface. Coastlines drown, ice dams burst. Freshwater floods the oceans, weather patterns destabilize. For small, mobile communities, this is survivable. For complex systems, it is devastating. Civilization depends on predictability, seasons that arrive on time, rivers that flood gently rather than catastrophically, skies that can be read. When these assumptions fail, knowledge becomes obsolete overnight. This is where the idea of reset stops being metaphorical. A reset is not annihilation. It is loss of continuity, the breakage of systems that require stability to function. The archaeological record carries hints of this. Gaps where occupation should continue, cultures that vanish without clear successors, technologies that appear, disappear, and later reappear in altered form. Such patterns are often explained locally. A drought here, a migration there, war, assimilation. Each explanation works in isolation. But when viewed globally, a larger rhythm emerges. Around the end of the last ice age, many regions show signs of upheaval. Not uniform, but overlapping. Different cultures responding to the same destabilizing forces in different ways. If complex societies existed before this period, they would be especially vulnerable. Their advantage, coordination, would become a liability. Centralized systems fail faster than dispersed ones. Those who survive would not be the most advanced, but the most adaptable. Knowledge would fracture. What remains would be what could be carried, remembered, simplified. This is where memory becomes selective. Practical skills endure. Abstract frameworks collapse. Monumental architecture sinks. Portable knowledge survives. When conditions stabilize again, the survivors rebuild using what they remember. Not everything. Only what still makes sense in the new world. This process does not produce innovation. It produces reconstruction. The Sumerian material reads like the output of such a process. Not exuberant invention, but careful reassembly. Systems tuned for a world that has already proven hostile to excess. The flood narrative may preserve memory of this destabilization, filtered through generations. Water stands in for unpredictability. The flood is singular in story, but plural in experience. Resets do not need to be total to be effective. They only need to disrupt continuity beyond repair. From this perspective, civilization is not a staircase. It is a spiral. Each turn revisits similar structures at different levels of memory. If this spiral has turned multiple times, then Sumer may occupy one such turn, not the first, but one that retained enough coherence to write. Writing changes everything. It externalizes memory. It fixes what was once fluid. It allows a civilization to speak across collapse, albeit imperfectly. But writing also freezes assumptions. It preserves frameworks that may no longer fit future conditions. It can become a burden as much as a gift. Perhaps this is why earlier resets left a little written record. Oral cultures adapt more easily. They forget faster. They survive differently. Sumer sits at a threshold, written enough to remember but not enough to explain. A civilization aware of cycles but unable to escape them. The idea of multiple resets is unsettling because it removes the promise of progress. It suggests that collapse is not failure, but function. That complexity naturally overshoots the stability of its environment. In this view, the question is not whether civilization will reset again, but what will pass through the reset. What knowledge will survive? What systems will be remembered? What assumptions will be carried forward unquestioned? The Sumerians may have asked similar questions quietly, indirectly. Their focus on order, appeasement, and balance suggests a deep awareness of fragility. They did not write manifestos for the future. They wrote ledgers, calendars, lists. The tools of survival, not of ambition. If we are the seventh civilization, then the number itself matters less than the pattern it implies. A rhythm of rise, stabilization, fragmentation, and erasure. Each cycle believes it is unique. Each believes its collapse would be unprecedented. Each underestimates the planet's indifference. The Earth does not reset out of malice. It resets because systems exceed limits. Ice melts, water moves, energy redistributes. Civilization is not exempt from this physics. It is embedded within it. The Sumerian records do not accuse the earth. They do not moralize climate. They accept instability as part of existence. Perhaps that acceptance is the real inheritance they left behind. Not knowledge of gods or kings, but awareness of cycles. If so, then the most important question is not how many civilizations came before us. It is whether we will recognize the signs of reset when they appear, or whether we will, like those before, mistake continuity for permanence until the spiral turns again. And when it does, what fragments of our world will remain coherent enough to be rebuilt, and which will dissolve back into silence, like so many cities beneath rising water? Memory does not survive on its own. It is carried, curated, and controlled, often by those least visible in the stories that follow. In early civilizations, memory does not belong to everyone. It gathers in specific places among specific roles, protected by ritual and routine. Writing does not democratize knowledge, it concentrates it. In Sumer, writing begins inside temples and administrative centers. It tracks offerings, labor, land, and time. Those who can read and write do not form a broad class. They are specialists trained within institutions that regulate access. Knowledge moves vertically, not horizontally. From the heavens to kings, from kings to priests, from priests to scribes. Rarely the other way around. This structure is not presented as oppression. It is presented as necessity. Order requires custody. Custody requires restriction. When survival depends on precision, mistakes cannot be tolerated. Such a system makes sense in a post-collapse world. When continuity has already failed once, redundancy becomes dangerous. Multiple interpretations fracture alignment. Control preserves coherence. The temple becomes more than a religious center. It is an archive, a memory vault, a place where time is stabilized through repetition. Ritual reenacts cosmic order. Calendars align human activity with celestial rhythm. Writing fixes transactions so they can be repeated reliably. What is preserved is not story, but function. This explains why so much early writing feels dry to modern readers. It is not meant to inspire. It is meant to endure. Emotion is inefficient. Ambiguity is risky. The priests who maintain these systems do not claim authorship. They position themselves as intermediaries between gods and people, between past and present, between chaos and order. This intermediary role gives them quiet power. Not the power to invent history, but the power to decide what remains active within it. When knowledge is inherited rather than discovered, the role of the custodian becomes central. They decide which fragments are stable enough to transmit and which are too dangerous, too unstable, too incomplete. Over time, this selection shapes reality, not through deception, but through omission. Later cultures will accuse such institutions of suppression, but suppression implies intent. The early evidence suggests something more restrained, a narrowing of focus driven by survival logic. After collapse, the goal is not truth in its fullness. The goal is functionality. If earlier civilizations possessed broader or deeper knowledge, much of it may have been incompatible with a diminished world. Technologies that require stable climates, large populations, or abundant resources would be useless or harmful. What survives, then, is not the best knowledge, but the most resilient. The Sumerian system reflects this. Its gods are not omnipotent. They are administrators. They manage domains. They enforce boundaries. They respond to imbalance. The myths do not celebrate curiosity. They warn against transgression. Knowledge is powerful but dangerous when misaligned. This worldview discourages expansion of memory. It favors repetition. The past becomes a reference point, not a field of inquiry. As centuries pass, this conservatism solidifies. What was once pragmatic becomes sacred. Procedures harden into doctrine. Custodians become authorities. By the time later civilizations inherit fragments of Sumerian thought, the original context has already thinned. Symbols replace functions, ritual replaces maintenance. This is how control emerges, not through conquest, but through continuity. Those who preserve the system define reality by maintaining it. This process does not require malice, it requires stability. And stability, once achieved, resists disruption. The idea of previous civilizations becomes uncomfortable in such a framework. It introduces uncertainty. It suggests that order is temporary, that authority is not absolute, that memory can be lost. These ideas threaten alignment. They encourage speculation. They loosen the grip of ritual. Thus, they fade. Not through erasure, but through neglect. The silence around what came before Sumer may be the result of this narrowing. Not a deliberate cover-up, but a natural consequence of survival-driven memory management. As civilizations grow more confident, they rewrite this inheritance. They transform caution into destiny, control into doctrine, custody into power. History becomes linear, progress becomes assumed. The past is simplified to support the present. By the time modern chronology emerges, the possibility of multiple resets feels disruptive. It undermines narratives of advancement. It complicates identity. And so it is resisted. Yet the earliest records do not resist it. They accommodate it quietly. Floods happen, kingship resumes, teachers arrive, teachers leave, no outrage, no denial. This suggests that early custodians understood something later institutions forgot. That memory is fragile, that truth does not survive intact, that systems must adapt to loss. If we are the seventh civilization, then we are also the inheritors of multiple acts of selection. What we know is what survived being useful. What we do not know may have been too heavy to carry through collapse. This realization reframes the idea of suppression. It is not always about hiding truth. Sometimes it is about lightening the load. The danger is that over time, selection hardens into belief. What survives is mistaken for what mattered most. What was lost is assumed to have never existed. And so history closes in on itself. The spiral tightens. Each cycle believes it is complete. The Sumerian record resists this closure, not by revealing everything, but by leaving gaps too deliberate to ignore. The presence of institutions capable of preserving memory, combined with their refusal to narrate origins, suggests an awareness of limits. They knew that some knowledge does not survive transmission, that some truths destabilize more than they enlighten. This is not wisdom or cowardice, it is adaptation. But adaptation has consequences. When memory is curated long enough, the curators become invisible. The system feels natural, inevitable. And those living within it forget that it was ever assembled from fragments salvaged after collapse. Perhaps the most unsettling question is not who controls history, but whether history itself is shaped by what can survive repeated endings. If so, then the story of humanity is not written by the first civilization, but by the last one that remembers just enough to begin again. And if we are not the last, then what we choose to preserve now will determine how the next awakening understands the silence we leave behind. When stories repeat across cultures that never met, coincidence becomes an unsatisfying explanation. Floods that erase the world but spare a few, teachers who arrive after catastrophe bearing law and measurement, ages before memory, followed by an age of shortening lives. These motifs appear in places separated by oceans, languages, and millennia. They are not identical, they do not copy each other, yet they rhyme. Comparative myth has long treated this as metaphor, shared human psychology, universal fear. The mind, confronted with chaos, invents similar stories. This explanation has merit, but it falters at the details, because the similarities do not cluster around emotion alone, they cluster around structure. In Mesopotamia, kingship descends after a flood. In Mesoamerica, earlier ages end by water, fire, or wind before a new order begins. In South Asia, yugas cycle through decline and renewal. In the Mediterranean, lost golden ages recede into memory as time itself degrades. These are not just stories of destruction, they are stories of sequence. Sequence implies expectation. An understanding that what exists now is not permanent and not first. What is absent in many of these traditions is triumph. There is little sense of humanity conquering nature. Instead, there is resignation. A quiet acknowledgement that order is borrowed and temporary. The Sumerian material fits this pattern precisely. It does not argue that the world was created for humans. It presents humans as participants in a larger cycle, governed by forces that predate them. The gods are not creators of the universe. They are managers within it. This managerial cosmology appears elsewhere as well. Deities who assign roles rather than invent reality. Beings who maintain balance rather than rewrite fate. Such figures suggest a worldview where order must be constantly upheld against entropy. Entropy, though unnamed, is everywhere. Cities decay, floods recur, knowledge fragments, memory shortens. Comparative mythology reveals another subtle consistency. Earlier ages are often described as more stable, longer lasting, closer to the source of order. Later ages are shorter, more chaotic, more violent. Time itself seems to accelerate toward breakdown. This is not how progress narratives behave. Progress imagines improvement. These myths imagine degradation. It is tempting to read moral judgment into this, that humanity became corrupt, sinful, or forgetful. But the texts themselves rarely insist on blame. They describe decline as process, not punishment. This aligns with geological reality. Stability is rare. The Earth does not preserve ideal conditions indefinitely. Climate oscillates. Resources shift. Systems that once worked fail under new constraints. If civilizations emerged multiple times under favorable conditions, they would each experience a similar arc. Rapid organization. Period of stability. Fragmentation as conditions change. Collapse or transformation. Myth, in this context, becomes compressed history. Not accurate in detail, but faithful in shape. The repetition of reset narratives across cultures may reflect shared experience rather than shared imagination. Different groups responding to the same planetary rhythms in different symbolic languages. This does not require global civilization. It requires global vulnerability. Human populations do not need to be connected to experience similar shocks. A rapidly warming planet affects everyone. Rising seas do not respect borders. Atmospheric changes ripple worldwide. If early complex societies clustered in fertile, low-lying regions, they would be disproportionately affected by such shifts. Their collapse would feel simultaneous, even if culturally distinct. Survivors would carry fragments of memory forward. Each culture would encode those fragments according to its own symbols, values, and environment. Over generations, literal memory would fade, leaving pattern. That pattern is what we now compare. This reframes comparative myth not as fantasy, but as sediment. Layered memory compacted over time, preserving shape even as detail erodes. The Sumerian texts stand out because they are early enough to retain more structure than story. They have not yet transformed cycles into allegory. They still speak in administrative tones. Later myths grow ornate because the original context is lost. Story replaces procedure. Symbol replaces system. But the underlying rhythm remains visible to those who look across cultures rather than within them. This rhythm challenges the idea that civilization is a singular event radiating outward. Instead, it suggests recurrence, independent awakenings shaped by similar constraints. If this is true, then the question of influence becomes secondary. Cultures need not have borrowed from one another to remember the same thing. They only needed to survive the same kind of loss. The persistence of these patterns also explains why the idea of multiple civilizations is often resisted. It destabilizes linear identity. It suggests that modern humanity is not exceptional, but iterative. Iteration is unsettling because it implies replaceability. Yet the myths themselves do not resist this idea, they accept it. They warn that ages pass. That order dissolves, that renewal follows loss. What they do not explain is why memory fades so completely each time, why lessons are not accumulated, why each cycle must relearn fragility. One possibility is scale. Each civilization grows larger, more complex, more interconnected. Each collapse therefore erases more information. The larger the system, the harder it is to reboot with fidelity. Another possibility is selection. Only certain kinds of knowledge survive catastrophe. Those that depend on specialization, energy surplus, or delicate infrastructure vanish first. What remains are stories, and stories, while resilient, distort. The Sumerians wrote before distortion fully set in. They wrote close enough to a reset to remember its outline, but far enough to lack its details. Comparative myth then becomes a mirror. It reflects the same outline from different angles, blurred by time. Seen this way, the similarities are not coincidence, they are convergence. Convergence toward a shared human experience of instability on a restless planet. If we are the seventh civilization, then the number itself is symbolic, not literal. It represents repetition acknowledged but not counted precisely. A recognition that we are not alone in time. What matters is not whether there were 6 before us, but whether there will be one after. The myths do not answer that. They only suggest that cycles continue until something breaks the pattern. Whether that break is technological, ethical, or ecological remains unknown. What the myths agree on is simpler and more unsettling. That remembering alone is not enough. That knowing cycles exist does not prevent them. And that awareness, without adaptation, changes nothing. As the patterns align across cultures, a final question begins to form, quietly, without urgency. If every civilization believes it understands the past better than those before it, what makes us certain that we are the exception, and not simply the next variation of a very old story, retold once again, just before the silence returns? Absence is rarely treated as evidence. It is easier to trust what can be touched, catalogued, displayed behind glass. Yet in the study of deep history, absence accumulates weight. When expected traces fail to appear again and again, the silence itself begins to speak. There are places where continuity should be visible. River valleys occupied for tens of thousands of years. Fertile plains that would naturally attract settlement generation after generation. Regions with stable climates during key transitional periods, and yet in many of these places the record jumps. Layers skip. Complexity appears without a visible lead-in, then vanishes just as abruptly. Archaeology explains these gaps carefully: erosion, rising water tables, urban overbuilding, incomplete excavation. Each explanation is valid and none are dishonest, but when gaps align across regions and eras, explanation becomes pattern. Consider the expectation of gradualism. Tools should become more refined step by step. Settlements should expand incrementally. Symbol systems should show hesitation before coherence. Yet time and again, we encounter moments where refinement arrives fully shaped. Not perfect, but stable enough to function immediately. This does not mean earlier stages did not exist. It means they did not survive in ways we can easily recognize. The problem is not that evidence is missing. The problem is that what remains behaves as though something substantial preceded it. Stone tools appear with standardized forms. Architectural layouts repeat recognizable ratios. Symbolic motifs emerge already embedded in cosmology. These are not spontaneous coincidences. They imply memory. Memory does not require written language. It requires transmission. Skills taught, habits passed, frameworks inherited. If civilizations before Sumer existed primarily in environments that are now submerged, unstable, or buried beneath later occupation, their physical traces would be scarce. What would survive would be the least visible elements, proportions, concepts, assumptions about how society should be organized. This kind of inheritance leaves no ruins, it leaves behavior. The early Sumerian world behaves as though it is reenacting a script whose authorship is forgotten. Roles are assumed quickly, authority is accepted, cosmic order is treated as fragile and in need of constant maintenance. There is little evidence of philosophical debate about first principles, no visible struggle over whether the heavens matter or whether law is necessary. These questions feel settled before the record begins. This settled quality is unsettling. Modern societies debate their foundations constantly. We argue over legitimacy, rights, structure. Early Sumer does not. It operates. This operational tone suggests a culture more concerned with preventing breakdown than exploring possibility. Such concern usually follows trauma. The absence of certain technologies is also revealing. One might expect that if earlier civilizations were advanced, they would leave behind spectacular devices or materials, but advancement does not always prioritize durability. A society optimized for efficiency rather than monumentality may leave almost nothing recognizable after collapse. Digital data does not fossilize. Complex machines corrode. Infrastructure disappears. What remains are simple tools and habits that resemble those of less complex cultures. Future archaeologists might mistake our own era for a brief anomaly, visible only through scattered plastics and altered sediments. Absence, then, is not emptiness. It is erasure shaped by physics. The Earth favours certain materials over others. Stone over metal, clay tablets over paper, massive structures over delicate systems. Civilizations that build lightly disappear more completely. If earlier cycles favoured efficiency, mobility, or organic materials, they would leave little behind for us to find. Their presence would be detectable only through discontinuities in later cultures. Sumer may represent such a discontinuity, a sudden reappearance of complexity in a world that had recently lost it. This would explain the careful tone of its records, the avoidance of speculation, the emphasis on appeasing forces beyond control. A culture that has seen order collapse would not romanticize innovation. It would distrust novelty. It would revere stability. Absence also appears in mythology as forgetting, lost ages, forgotten names, times before memory. These are not nostalgic inventions. They are acknowledgements of limitation. When later cultures look back, they see a haze. They sense depth without clarity. They feel that something important lies just beyond reach. This sensation is often dismissed as imagination, but imagination tends to elaborate. It adds detail. These myths do the opposite. They strip detail away. They speak of loss without description, of time before time, of ages that ended without lesson. This restraint mirrors the archaeological gaps. Both suggest not ignorance, but truncation. The temptation is to fill these gaps with certainty, to declare that absence means non-existence, that what cannot be proven did not happen. This is a useful rule for many purposes. It prevents fantasy from overwhelming evidence. But when applied rigidly to deep time, it can become a blindfold. The past does not owe us clarity. It owes us only what survives. The Sumerian records survive because they were inscribed in clay and stored deliberately. They speak because someone believed preservation mattered. What did not survive may have mattered just as much. If civilizations before Sumer collapsed under environmental stress, their priorities would have shifted rapidly. Survival would trump documentation. Memory would compress. What remained would be whatever could be carried forward easily. The result would be cultures that feel older than they are, systems that appear prematurely mature, stories that refer to lost depth without explaining it. These are exactly the qualities that disturb conventional timelines. Absence becomes most powerful when it refuses to behave randomly, when it appears precisely where transition should be visible, the transition from foraging to agriculture, from village to city, from myth to administration. These should be noisy, chaotic shifts. Yet in the Sumerian case they are quiet. Quiet transitions suggest rehearsal, not rehearsal by individuals, but by humanity itself. Repeated attempts at complexity, each learning something about fragility. If so, then what we call progress may be memory slowly rebuilding itself across cycles, never fully recovering what was lost, but retaining enough to begin again. The seventh civilization, then, would not be defined by superiority, but by distance. Distance from the original alignment. Distance from the first coherence. Absence grows with each cycle. What we gain in innovation, we lose in memory. And perhaps that is why the deepest gaps in history feel so uncomfortable. They are not empty. They are saturated with things we no longer know how to recognize. The silence beneath the cities, beneath the myths, beneath the numbers, is not a void. It is a residue, and it leaves us with a question that grows heavier the longer it lingers. If absence is the most honest witness of collapse, then what absences are we creating now? And how will they shape the civilization that wakes after us, wondering why its beginnings feel so strangely incomplete? Modern chronology is built like a scaffold, precise at the top, uncertain at the base. The closer history approaches the present, the sharper its dates become, the more confident its lines. As it stretches backward, certainty softens. Centuries blur into millennia. Millennia dissolve into eras. And somewhere beyond a certain depth, the timeline becomes more suggestion than statement. This is not a failure of scholarship. It is a structural limitation. Time resists compression. Evidence thins. Context erodes. Yet the human mind prefers continuity. It prefers a clean ascent from simplicity to complexity, from silence to speech. This preference shapes interpretation. When faced with anomalies, advanced systems appearing abruptly, myths implying earlier ages, records hinting at cycles, chronology does not usually expand to accommodate them. Instead, the anomalies are compressed inward. They are reclassified as symbolic, misdated, or exceptional. The timeline remains intact, but at a cost. That cost is discomfort. Discomfort arises when explanation feels forced, when answers resolve questions too neatly, when uncertainty is treated as error rather than signal. The Sumerian material produces this discomfort repeatedly, not because it contradicts chronology outright, but because it refuses to align emotionally with the story we expect. It behaves like a continuation when we want a beginning. It speaks with calm authority when we expect discovery. To preserve a linear model, interpretation must work harder. Numbers become metaphor, descent becomes allegory, floods become local accidents. Each adjustment is reasonable. Together they create a fragile structure that must be defended continuously. This defense is rarely conscious. It is embedded in training, in method, in what feels intellectually safe. Chronology is not just a tool. It is a worldview, and worldviews resist revision. Extending history backward does more than add dates. It destabilizes identity. It suggests that modern humanity is not the culmination of a unique journey, but one iteration among many. It raises the possibility that knowledge has been lost before and will be again. Such possibilities challenge assumptions of progress. They complicate narratives of mastery. They introduce humility where confidence has long been cultivated. This is why discussions of deep antiquity often provoke strong reactions, not because evidence is weak, but because implications are heavy. If civilization has reset before, then collapse is not anomaly, it is precedent. Modern chronology emerged alongside modern confidence. As science advanced, it became tempting to treat the past as conquered territory, measured, mapped, explained. But deep time resists conquest. It humbles. The farther back one looks, the more interpretation relies on inference. Inference requires imagination disciplined by evidence. When imagination is constrained too tightly, it becomes brittle. When it is too loose, it becomes fantasy. The tension between these extremes defines debates about early civilization. Those who propose deeper timelines are often accused of speculation. Those who resist them are accused of denial. Both positions miss the quiet truth that uncertainty itself is the most honest state. The Sumerian records do not ask us to believe in specific lost civilizations. They ask us to notice tone, structure, absence, pattern. They do not shout revision. They whisper doubt. Chronology struggles with whispers. It prefers declarations. This struggle becomes visible in how questions are framed. Instead of asking whether civilization could have arisen earlier under different conditions, the question becomes whether evidence is sufficient to prove it conclusively. The burden of proof becomes absolute. Yet no other field demands such certainty at its edges. Cosmology accepts unseen matter. Biology accepts extinct lineages inferred from fragments. Geology reconstructs continents that no longer exist. History alone often insists that what cannot be proven cleanly should not be considered. This insistence protects rigor, but it can also protect comfort. The possibility of multiple civilizations does not require rejecting established timelines. It requires loosening their exclusivity, allowing that what we call history may be one visible layer atop many invisible ones. This layered view aligns better with Earth systems. Geological strata do not erase what lies beneath. They bury it. Human activity leaves similar strata. Each civilization builds upon the remnants of the previous, often without knowing it. Chronology flattens this complexity. It reduces layers to lines. The Sumerian world resists flattening. Its records feel layered. They acknowledge before and after without specifying first. This ambiguity is not accidental. It reflects a culture aware of limits. Limits of memory, limits of explanation, limits of control. Modern discomfort with this ambiguity reveals more about us than about them. We seek mastery over time. We want to stand at the end of a story that makes sense. But what if the story is not linear? What if it is recursive? What if meaning does not accumulate but oscillates? In such a model, chronology becomes less important than pattern recognition. The question shifts from, when did this happen, to, how does this keep happening? This shift is difficult because it undermines prediction. If collapse is cyclical, then no amount of advancement guarantees immunity. This is why deep history often feels threatening. It suggests that intelligence alone does not ensure survival. That complexity carries risk. The Sumerian record does not moralize this risk. It accepts it. It documents continuity without claiming permanence. Perhaps the most unsettling implication is that modern civilization, for all its data and foresight, may be less prepared for reset than its predecessors. We have optimized for growth, not recovery, for innovation, not memory. If a reset were to occur now, what would survive? What would be salvageable? What knowledge could be carried forward without infrastructure? The Sumerians preserved lists, calendars, ratios, not stories of greatness, not blueprints for domination. Their chronology was humble. It knew it was not complete. Our chronology often forgets this humility. It presents itself as definitive, even at its edges. The discomfort stirred by Sumerian ambiguity is therefore instructive. It invites us to reconsider how we relate to the past, not as owners, but as interpreters standing on unstable ground. If we are the seventh civilization, then our greatest challenge is not discovering how many came before. It is deciding whether we will allow uncertainty to inform wisdom, or whether we will compress it into comfort until the next layer closes above us. Because time does not require our certainty to continue. It only requires that we exist long enough to leave a trace, and accept that one day that trace too may become an absence, quietly waiting to unsettle whoever comes next. Power rarely announces itself as control. It prefers continuity. It prefers to look like preservation, like care, like the quiet insistence that things remain as they are because change would be dangerous. In the long arc of civilization, power survives best when it aligns itself with memory. After collapse, those who rebuild do not seek dominance first. They seek stability. Stability requires rules. Rules require reference points, and reference points, once established, harden into authority. In early civilizations, this authority gathers around institutions rather than individuals. Temples, priesthoods, later empires, and schools. These are not conspiracies. They are solutions to a problem that appears after every reset: how to prevent chaos from returning too quickly. The problem is that solutions designed for survival often outlive the conditions that required them. What begins as guardianship becomes gatekeeping. What begins as curation becomes exclusion. Over generations, the memory of why restrictions existed fades, while the restrictions themselves remain. This process is slow and almost invisible. No decree announces it. No villain appears. Knowledge simply narrows. In Sumer, this narrowing is subtle. Certain stories are repeated, others are not. Certain transitions are acknowledged. Others are left blank. The blanks are not random. They cluster around origins. Origins are dangerous. They invite comparison. They suggest alternatives. They imply that what exists now is not inevitable. Power prefers inevitability. As civilizations expand, their institutions grow more confident. They begin to universalize local truths. They project their own survival strategies backward, reinterpreting earlier records to fit newer frameworks. What was once a pragmatic response to fragility becomes doctrine. This is where history begins to be rewritten, not necessarily falsified, but simplified. Complexity is reduced. Cycles are flattened into lines. Uncertainty is reframed as ignorance. Later empires inherit this edited memory. They build their legitimacy on continuity with the past, but only a carefully curated version of it. One that supports hierarchy, obedience, and permanence. The idea of previous advanced civilizations becomes inconvenient in such a context. It introduces the possibility that empires fall not because of moral failure alone, but because of structural limits. Limits that no amount of authority can overcome. If collapse is inevitable, then power is provisional. This is not a comforting idea for those who govern. Thus, narratives evolve. The past is reframed as primitive. Progress becomes destiny. History becomes a ladder, not a loop. In this ladder, Sumer is placed at the bottom, the first step. Crude, simple, admirable only because it led to us. But the Sumerian material resists this placement. Its sophistication appears too early. Its restraint feels too knowing. Its silence around origins too deliberate. To reconcile this, later interpreters must explain away its anomalies. Long rains become myth. Descent becomes allegory. Floods become local accidents. None of these interpretations are false, but they are incomplete. They close questions rather than open them. Control over history rarely looks like censorship, it looks like consensus. Once an interpretation becomes standard, alternatives feel unnecessary, even disruptive. Students learn what is settled. Researchers work within accepted bounds. Funding favours safe questions. Over time, the boundaries of inquiry harden. Not because anyone enforces them aggressively, but because stepping outside them feels unproductive. This is how power maintains itself across generations without ever naming itself as such. The Sumerian record sits just outside this comfort zone. Too early to be dismissed, too strange to be absorbed fully. It remains an edge case. Edge cases are where systems reveal their limits. If we accept that civilizations may have risen and fallen before Sumer, then history becomes less a march toward enlightenment and more a series of negotiations with instability. Authority becomes situational, knowledge becomes fragile. This reframing does not strip meaning from history. It changes where meaning resides. Meaning shifts from achievement to awareness, from dominance to adaptability, from permanence to humility. Institutions built to preserve order often struggle with humility. Their legitimacy depends on continuity, not contingency. Thus, the idea of resets is tolerated only as myth, never as model. Yet models matter. They shape preparedness. A society that believes collapse is impossible behaves differently from one that expects it. Sumer behaved like a society that expected collapse. Its focus on appeasement, balance, and repetition suggests a deep awareness of vulnerability. Later societies, more confident, become more ambitious. They build monuments meant to last forever. They expand aggressively. They innovate relentlessly. And when they fall, the shock is greater. The control of history, then, is not about hiding the past. It is about protecting the present from uncomfortable parallels. If we are the seventh civilization, the number itself is less important than what it implies, that our systems are not unique and that our confidence may be misplaced. Power resists this implication not because it is malicious, but because it threatens coherence. Societies need shared narratives to function, but narratives that deny fragility often create it. The Sumerian texts do not deny fragility. They encode it quietly. Floods happen, authority relocates, teachers leave. No one promises permanence. This honesty may be their greatest legacy. As we move further from that legacy, we replace honesty with assurance. We tell ourselves that this time is different, that technology will save us, that knowledge will accumulate indefinitely. History, curated for comfort, supports these beliefs. Yet beneath the curated layers, the older patterns remain visible to those who look for them, in myths that repeat, in gaps that persist, in systems that feel prematurely aged. The question is not whether power has shaped history. It always has. The question is whether we can recognize when history is shaping power in return, when the limits of the past are pressing quietly against the present. Because if control over memory determines how civilizations behave, then the greatest act of power is not domination, but forgetting. And forgetting, once complete, does not announce itself. It feels like certainty. It feels like stability. It feels like the end of the story. Until, without warning, the ground shifts again, and the next civilization awakens, standing on the remains of ours, wondering why its beginnings feel so strangely incomplete. By the time the idea of a seventh civilization begins to take shape, it no longer feels like a claim. It feels like a recognition, not a conclusion reached through proof, but a pattern noticed through repetition. A sense that history has been unfolding in layers, each one believing itself to be the surface. The number itself is almost incidental. 6, 7, 9. Myth and record rarely agree on counting. What matters is the recurrence, the feeling that civilizations do not begin from nothing, but awaken into worlds already shaped by prior order and prior loss. To awaken is not the same as to originate. Every civilization tells a story about its birth. These stories vary in detail, but they share a common impulse: to anchor identity. To say, this is where we started, this is who we are. Yet when those stories are examined closely, they often drift backward into ambiguity. Gods intervene. Time stretches. Memory thins. Sumer's story does not drift. It stops. It gestures toward before, then turns away. Not out of ignorance, but restraint, as if to look too closely would destabilize what remains. If this is the seventh awakening, then the previous 6 are not meant to be remembered in full. They are meant to be inferred. their existence felt rather than known. This reframes the role of evidence. Instead of searching for grand ruins or impossible machines, the focus shifts to subtler traces. Organizational instincts, repeated solutions, the same answers rediscovered under different names. Civilization, in this view, behaves less like an invention and more like a memory resurfacing under pressure. Pressure matters. Civilizations do not arise randomly. They emerge when conditions briefly align. Stable climate, predictable seasons, abundant resources. These windows do not remain open indefinitely. When they close, complexity becomes a liability. Systems collapse not because they fail, but because they cannot adapt quickly enough. Survivors carry fragments forward, not blueprints, but intuitions, not technologies, but habits of thought. The next civilization builds on these intuitions, often mistaking them for insight. Over time, intuition hardens into tradition. Tradition becomes law, law becomes identity. By the 7th cycle, the distance from the original alignment is vast. Memory is diluted. Confidence grows. Confidence is dangerous. It convinces a civilization that it has finally solved the problem. That collapse was something primitive societies experienced, not something that could happen now. That complexity itself is protection, yet complexity amplifies fragility. Interdependence accelerates failure. Systems optimized for efficiency lack redundancy. The Sumerians seem to have understood this instinctively. Their focus was not expansion, but balance. Not conquest, but appeasement. They did not believe themselves immune. Later civilizations lost this humility. Each believed itself to be the culmination. Each trusted that the past had been surpassed. If we are the 7th, then we are also the most distant from remembering why caution mattered. Our myths are no longer about cycles. They're about progress. Our gods promise salvation, not recurrence. Our stories end in triumph or apocalypse, not renewal. This is a profound shift. Earlier cultures accepted repetition. They expected decline. They built rituals to maintain balance rather than systems to guarantee dominance. We build systems that assume growth without limit. This difference may define the 7th civilization more than any technology. The danger is not that we will collapse. Collapse is natural. The danger is that we will collapse without understanding that it has happened before, and therefore without knowing how to respond. Previous awakenings likely occurred among people who still remembered loss. Their civilizations were cautious. Ours is forgetful. This forgetfulness shows itself in how we treat the earth. Resources are extracted as though replenishment were guaranteed. Stability is assumed. Disruption is treated as anomaly. The past offers no support for such assumptions. If civilizations are responses to brief periods of planetary calm, then calm is the exception, not the rule. Our era may feel stable only because we are living inside its peak. Peaks feel permanent from within. The Sumerian texts sit near the base of one such peak. They reflect a world newly stabilized after upheaval. Their restraint, their focus on order, their silence about origins, all suggest awareness of how fragile that stability was. They did not ask how to advance. They asked how to endure. This difference in orientation matters. Endurance prioritizes memory. Advancement prioritizes novelty. Novelty accelerates forgetting. If the 7th civilization forgets faster than it learns, then it will repeat the cycle without recognizing it. The number 7, then, becomes less a badge of status and more a warning. Not chosen, but counted. Not elevated, but late. Late civilizations inherit complexity without context. They possess tools without understanding the conditions under which those tools remain safe. This inheritance creates confidence divorced from wisdom. Wisdom, in earlier cycles, may have consisted simply of knowing when not to push further, when to slow down, when to appease rather than dominate. Such wisdom is difficult to maintain in large interconnected systems driven by competition. The Sumerians lived in smaller worlds. Their limits were visible. Our limits are abstract, delayed, outsourced. This abstraction deepens forgetfulness. If collapse comes, it will not feel like punishment. It will feel like surprise. And surprise is the clearest sign that civilization has lost its memory of cycles. The idea that we are the seventh civilization is unsettling because it reframes modern humanity not as exceptional, but as habitual, not as final, but as current. It suggests that intelligence does not free us from patterns, it merely allows us to reenact them with greater complexity. The Sumerian records do not accuse us of this. They do not predict us. They simply demonstrate what it looks like to stand at the beginning of a cycle, with some awareness of what lies behind. We stand much farther from that awareness. Perhaps that is the true meaning of being seventh. Not superior, but distant. Not enlightened, but buffered by layers of forgotten experience. And perhaps the quietest question embedded in this recognition is also the most urgent. If earlier civilizations sensed their fragility and acted accordingly, what does it say about us that we insist on permanence, even as signs of instability multiply around us? The answer is not found in prophecy or blame. It is found in attention. Attention to patterns, attention to silence, attention to the possibility that what we call history is not a straight line behind us, but a spiral we're still moving through. And if that is so, then the seventh civilization is not defined by what it knows. It is defined by whether it notices in time that it has been here before, even if it cannot remember how it ended. At the end of a long cycle, civilizations rarely recognize themselves as endings. They experience themselves as continuations, as the present tense of an unfinished story. From within, collapse does not look like collapse. It looks like strain, like noise, like complexity turning against itself. The Sumerian texts never describe an end of civilization. They describe ends of phases, floods, withdrawals, transitions, authority moves, knowledge relocates. The world does not conclude, it reconfigures. This refusal to dramatize endings may be the most important lesson they leave behind. Endings, when they come, are quiet at first. Systems overload subtly. Trust erodes before structures fail. Signals are misread as anomalies. Warnings are treated as exaggerations. Life continues. Only later, when memory looks back, does the shape of collapse become visible. If civilizations have risen and fallen before, then each one likely believed it had transcended the causes of previous failures. Each believed its technologies, its institutions, its insights would prevent repetition. Yet repetition persists. This suggests that collapse is not caused by ignorance alone. It is caused by imbalance between growth and restraint, between complexity and adaptability, between memory and ambition. The Sumerians encoded this awareness indirectly. Their gods punished excess. Their myths warned against overreach. Their rituals sought equilibrium rather than expansion. They did not imagine salvation through dominance. They imagined survival through balance. Later civilizations shifted this orientation. Expansion became virtue. Control became proof of progress. Nature became something to master rather than appease. This shift produced extraordinary achievements. It also produced unprecedented fragility. The seventh civilization, if such a designation has meaning, may be defined by this tension. Never before has a civilization possessed such reach while remaining so dependent on narrow margins of stability. Our systems span the globe. Our knowledge travels instantly. Our infrastructures interlock tightly. This creates efficiency, but it also removes buffers. Earlier civilizations collapse locally. Ours would collapse systemically. This does not make us doomed. It makes us exposed. The warning embedded in ancient records is not apocalyptic. It is observational. That complexity amplifies consequence. that growth accelerates feedback, that forgetting cycles does not prevent them. The Sumerian scribes did not write to instruct the future, they wrote to stabilize the present. Yet their restraint leaves space for reflection. They did not insist that their world would endure, they acted as though it might not. This attitude shaped what they chose to preserve. Not stories of glory, but tools of order. Not declarations of destiny, but records of balance. If collapse were to occur again, what would we preserve? Would we preserve systems that require global coordination to function? Technologies that depend on rare materials? Knowledge encoded in fragile media? Or would we preserve principles, ways of thinking, awareness of limits? The difference matters. If future survivors awaken into a quieter world, what would help them rebuild without repeating our mistakes? What fragments of our civilization would feel like inheritance rather than burden? The Sumerians left behind calendars aligned with the sky, legal principles tied to balance, myths that warned against excess, records that acknowledged fragility. They did not leave behind instructions for conquest. This choice may explain why their memory persists. Civilizations that define themselves by dominance often vanish more completely. Their monuments crumble, their ideologies age poorly, their achievements require contexts that no longer exist. Civilizations that define themselves by balance leave subtler traces. They survive as patterns. If we are the seventh civilization, then the question is not whether we will be the last. The question is what pattern we will leave. Patterns do not require intention. They emerge from behavior, from what is repeated, from what is normalized. If we normalize extraction, the pattern left behind will be depletion. If we normalize acceleration, the pattern will be instability. If we normalize forgetting, the pattern will be surprise. The ancient records suggest another option. Normalizing awareness of cycles, normalizing humility, normalizing preparation for loss without obsession with catastrophe. This does not mean rejecting progress. It means contextualizing it. Progress without memory is momentum. Memory without adaptability is stagnation. The balance between them is fragile. It requires constant attention. Perhaps this is why ancient cultures ritualized balance. Ritual is repetition with awareness. It slows time. It reminds participants that order must be renewed. Modern civilization has few such rituals. We rely on automation rather than attention, on systems rather than habits. This makes us powerful. It also makes us forgetful. The idea that we are the seventh civilization is unsettling because it removes comfort. It suggests that intelligence alone does not guarantee continuity. That knowledge can be lost. That memory can thin beyond recognition. But it also offers something quieter. It suggests that collapse is not annihilation, that something always survives, that even after loss, humanity reorients, rebuilds, and remembers just enough. The danger is not collapse itself. The danger is repeating collapse blindly. The Sumerians standing closer to a reset seemed to understand this. Their silence around origins was not denial. It was respect. They knew that some things, once broken, cannot be explained back into coherence. They must be lived with carefully. As this long thread draws to a close, no final answer emerges. No declaration about how many civilizations came before. No proof, no verdict. Only a pattern, observed quietly, across text and soil and myth. Civilizations rise when conditions allow. They stabilize when memory guides restraint. They fragment when growth outpaces balance. They fall when systems exceed adaptability. And then, after silence, something stirs again. The Sumerian records do not tell us how to avoid this. They do not offer escape. They offer recognition. Recognition that we are not the first to stand here. That others once believed they were secure. That memory faded. That cycles continued. If there is a warning embedded in this recognition, It is not dramatic. It is simple. Pay attention, not to prophecy, not to fear, but to patterns. Because the most dangerous moment for any civilization is not when collapse begins, but when it becomes unthinkable. And if we truly are the seventh, then the question that remains is not how we began or how many came before. It is whether, when the signs appear, we will recognize them as echoes, or mistake them for something entirely new, just as the ground shifts quietly beneath our feet and the long memory of the earth prepares once again to turn the page.